Today on Radio Free History, we pick up our discussion where we left off about Bauhaus, Stijl, the Vienna Secession, and the German Expressionists. By the end of the episode, you will see how the aesthetic decisions made in 1920s Germany affect the aesthetics that you see in the world today. I hope you enjoy it. Hi guys. Our conversation ran long, so we decided to release it as two separate episodes, 25A and 25B. If you want to listen to the full 5 hours in a single sitting, we've also released that as episode 25 on YouTube. In the first half of our conversation, we discussed how the politics of Weimar Germany affected the aesthetics and culture, perhaps most infamously in a passage of Mein Kampf. We started looking at Bauhaus, but we took a tangent into Holland to look at the Stijl movement, whose two most famous members were Theo van Doesburg and Piet Mondrian. We left off with the discussion of the Stijl movement's Rietveld Haus, and without further ado, that's where we pick back up. I hope you guys enjoy the rest of the conversation. This is the Rietveld Haus. Now, you see in the top left picture, you see all the old architecture, all the old houses, done in a nice, aesthetically pleasing style, and then this obnoxious guy decided to build this house on the end of the row.
He must have not liked his neighbors.
Well, his neighbors didn't like him either.
No, they halved my property value with this dumb house.
Well, apparently they all bullied his children ruthlessly, but that's just their way of saying, get the hell out of our neighborhood. And now this house is considered historic, so you can't even tear it down.
Oh, God. They did that with a drug bar in Toronto. They declared it a historical site.
Well, at a more fundamental level, what the fuck even is this thing?
Looks like some out of the original Halo.
Yeah.
Like some alien building.
Well, it's called the Rietveld House. Rietveld was a member of the Stijl movement, but I don't think I really need to say that this guy came from the same art movement as Mondrian with the crossword puzzle.
It looks like his terrible stuff.
One of the most basic psychological tests is to ask a kid to draw a house from memory, and inevitably the kid draws a rectangle with a triangle roof, a door, a window, and a couple of trees. I think they call that a schema in psychology.
Yeah, schema. It's like a shorthand, so your brain doesn't have to process things as deeply.
Yeah. Now, in the 1880s and 1890s, you have people like Frank Lloyd Wright, who said that, wait a second, we have new building materials, so we can create new designs. Houses don't need to look like that anymore, now that they don't need as many load-bearing walls.
If it ain't broken, don't fix it.
Yep. He said we have reinforced concrete, we can do things like cantilevering, and we have steel frames, so we can have open plans. And you have plate glass windows and a bunch of other things like central heating. So people like Frank Lloyd Wright said we can start building weird shit. Of course, in the case of Frank Lloyd Wright, it didn't always go well. At one point, he designed a house for his mistress and her children, and because of the open plan, the servants were not separated from his loved ones. And one day, a Caribbean manservant snapped and killed his mistress with an axe along with two of her children.
It's weird that it was a black guy who snapped and did random violence.
Yeah,
that's unusual. It's counterintuitive.
Yeah. There's always one, right?
I guess. Yeah.
Then he doused the place in gasoline and locked the door, killing 5 of the other staff members.
Yeah. Again, it's so strange that it was a black guy that just snapped and freaking did random violence and arson. That's bizarre.
Yeah. Well, I'm just going to say I will let you draw your own conclusions as to whether or not you should let your Caribbean manservant live in an open concept house with your mistress.
Yeah, I could see that. Wouldn't get off the drawing board if I was in that boardroom.
So when it comes to the Rietveld House, this is about 30 years after Frank Lloyd Wright. Well, 30 years after Frank Lloyd Wright had started. Frank Lloyd Wright was already established at this point. This guy's just trying to be obnoxious.
We need to get him a Caribbean manservant.
For whatever reason, he just wanted you to be able to see the graph paper that he used to sketch the drawings for this place.
What level of autism is that? That's high level. That's Sonic the Hedgehog level autism. That's Sonichu.
It's Sonichu.
This is Sonichu. This is his personal Sonichu. The first one got his wife killed because there was no cage for the manservant.
Well, but why is there such an imperative that it looks like it was drawn on a piece of graph paper? Like, one thing that might strike you as odd is if you look at the interior.
Oh, that's just as wrong and weird.
It's not just that the outside has to look like graph paper, the inside has to look like graph paper as well.
Yeah, even the inside looks like a house built by aliens that weren't perfectly familiar with the way that we live and conduct our housing.
It's not just that the entire interior has to match the outside, it's that the furniture has to match the weird graph paper aesthetic on the outside as well. If you like living in a cube, fine, but this is the 20s, and the architects are starting to get bold. They would start to insist that they design all the tables and the chairs and the couches in your house, and they would throw a hissy fit if you tried to remodel anything. Like, you couldn't just buy a comfortable chair without the architect bitching at you.
If my architect bitched at me, I'd pull the freaking, you hear me, Vonnegut? I'm going to put a stop payment on your check.
Well, these people thought it would violate the fucking harmony or whatever feng shui bullshit they were talking about.
You want to see violation? Keep running your mouth, buddy. Get my lazy boy in here with the TV.
Yeah. Well, where does this attitude come from? Why did the architect, or more generally the artist, think he could start micromanaging the people who were actually buying his work? Well, this is an episode about Germany. I'm already off on a tangent about this style in Holland. Now I have to go off on a tangent of a tangent to see how we got to this fucking point. We've talked a lot about how art is a nebulous concept that has essentially become meaningless by World War I. And if you've watched the last two episodes, you know that it's a 1-2 punch. On the one hand, every creative endeavor is deconstructing itself by the 20s. James Joyce, Marcel Proust are asking, what can I do with the form of the novel? Brecht and O'Neill are asking, what can I do with the form of the play? Ravel, Schoenberg, what can I do with the symphony, etc., etc. And eventually Duchamp says, what can I do with art itself? And puts a urinal in an art gallery.
It's all very painfully self-aware.
And this guy says, well, but what truly is art anyway? As if that's profound.
Like a fortune cookie profound.
On the other hand, you have a bunch of truly stupid academic theories coming out of post-revolutionary Russia, where Rodchenko said he put hundreds of hours into devoted research and determined that the final form of art is painting a canvas all one color. And now that he's done that, art is finished. We're now doing something called constructivism, which is the next creative endeavor now that we're finished with art, which is the genesis of every hideous art installation that has to ask a question. Watch the last episode. It really is as stupid as I'm talking about.
It's pushing propaganda, and if you say it's ugly, you go to the gulag.
10 years later, Stalin does an about-face and decides to send the artist to the gulag.
Oh, you gulag. Sooner or later, it's your turn, Ivan.
Yep. That's the thing. If you're afraid to complain about the communist government, you're ending up in the gulag anyways.
There's a saying in Russia, you today, me tomorrow.
Mm-hmm. You could make the argument that maybe art itself no longer exists at the point that this hideous house is built.
I don't want it to exist if this is art. Just bury it.
Well, the thing is, that explanation feels unsatisfying. Because whatever you think of this monstrosity, it's at least trying to accomplish something. I'm not sure what, but it's trying to accomplish something. I'm happy to say that Lotus Kang's work is completely vacuous and meaningless when she hangs exposed film from a ceiling. That truly is nothing. Fuck you, Lotus.
Yeah, seriously, fuck you, Lotus.
The Reitfeld house, it is something. It's the idea just as for Bauhaus, that the entire building has to be the creative vision of the artiste. We're not just talking about the floor plan being a little bit functional. The whole building, from the walls to the windows to the decorations to the furniture, the whole thing needs to be obnoxious. We were talking about Picasso doing prostitutes with anatomically incorrect tits, and now we're talking about an entire house vandalizing a residential street. Like, if art hadn't been destroyed by Duchamp's urinal, it's at least a completely different conception of what art is by the time you reach this point.
Yeah, we're definitely off the beaten path.
So what the fuck is going on? Well, when the official narrative seems off, usually you can cut through the bullshit by just going back to the timeline and putting things chronologically. Because that destroys a lot of official narratives.
Yeah, they do a lot of jumping around.
That they do. So let's take a step back. What is the official narrative exactly? Centuries of academic painting, then the Impressionists come along, then Vincent van Gogh cuts his ear off, you have a bunch of weird avant-garde art groups writing their manifestos in the early 20th century, then you have the Armory Show, then you have World War I, and then you have this weird Bauhaus and De Stijl shit changing how buildings are built. That's the official story. Something was clearly missed. When exactly did we shift from weird painting to weird architecture? That seems like a shuck and jive going on here. That seems like a weird shell game that somebody played. Yeah. We never talked about architecture until now, and now we're asking why this house is centered to the art narrative.
It's like artistic mission creep.
Remember that this is just the capital N narrative, curated by the Museum of Modern Art. So let's take a step back even farther.
I thought you meant from an African perspective.
These days, tomato, tomato. Now, these days, it's from a queer women of color perspective.
The black people are offended.
Let's take a step back even farther. We've talked about Paris as being the center of the art world. We've talked about Paris as being the center of the art world. And we've said that after World War II, New York City is going to unseat Paris as the center of modern art. But if you are autistic enough to have followed along for the last 22 hours and followed everything, something should seem a little bit strange. Our second episode was about 19th century art in London. Our third episode was about 19th century art in Paris. What happened to the London part of the storyline? That seems to have just died.
Did it get blown up during the Blitz?
This isn't the Blitz yet.
No,
this is
like whatever happened, the bombs fell on it, and it's like, well, we don't know. The Luftwaffe took that part of our history. But...
It's more American hegemony has decided to airbrush the glorious history of the British Empire out because the Americans think colonialism is terrible. All those Africans getting fed and having working hospitals. It's just horrible, isn't it?
But what else have the Romans given us?
Well, when these pictures here are taken, this is peak British Empire. London is literally the center of the world to the point where it's 0 degrees longitude. It's where we base all of our time zones off of.
Yeah. Greenwich Mean.
Doesn't it seem a little odd that London doesn't really play a role in the capital N narrative?
Yeah, it's too foggy. I don't know what the hell.
We've already established the capital N narrative is nonsense anyway, but history is written by the victors, and so are aesthetic standards. It really comes down to the fact that the New Deal generation of Americans prefer this weird modern shit over the old aesthetically pleasing Anglo stuff. And we'll be exploring that soon enough, but when the Americans take over the world, they decide that this is what art is going to be.
Couldn't they have just I don't know, done something like, why this?
Yeah, well, we need to take another step back and look at what was going on in London this whole time, because maybe that'll give us a clue to how architecture just got smuggled into the story, just underneath our noses without us seeing it.
Okay.
At the same time that the Impressionists are doing their paintings in the 1870s, 1880s, at the same time that Paul Durand Ruel is having some success selling them, if not in France, then at least in America, what was going on in London? Remember that in the 1880s, there is now a middle class in London and Paris, and you have a bunch of self-loathing bourgeoisie able to buy paintings from independent artists who at least had enough hustle to promote themselves. In London, you also have a middle class, and they have certain tastes. This is where you're going to get the concept of art that's not just a painting or a sculpture or even a building. This is where you're going to start getting the idea of art as the umbrella concept that covers everything from architecture to handicraft to build a whole space. So as simple as it would be to say that the concept of art was deconstructed to incoherence by Duchamp putting his urinal in an art gallery, that would just be too easy. In reality, with the rise of the middle class and the rise of nouveau riche people having their own tastes, art was always going to splinter into a lot of different things because it was never a thoroughly thought out concept in the first place.
This is why you define your terms, people.
Well, it was always the lofty academic ideals of a social climber from the Georgian era named Joshua Reynolds, who became the head of the Royal Academy. And, you know, just like warfare, when technology changes, warfare changes. When technology changes, art changes and philosophy changes. And in 1880s Britain, you have something called the arts and crafts movement. And this is concurrently with the Impressionists in Paris. You can't really call the arts and crafts movement an avant-garde movement because, you know, I've beaten it to death in this series that the Impressionists were not as big a deal in their own day as they are made out to be after the fact. So there wasn't really such thing as an avant-garde movement when the arts and crafts movement starts. But more importantly, the arts and crafts movement, it was started by two well-known establishment figures, William Morris and John Ruskin.
Okay.
This is avant-garde in the same way that like Miramax movies in the 90s and 2000s were, quote, independent, even though Miramax was owned by Disney.
Mm.
In hipster talk, they're not mainstream, but they're very far from being outsiders.
These are well-connected people.
Yeah. So what was the arts and crafts movement? This is a textile.
Okay. Needlepoint?
Yep.
Oh.
This is like curtains. This is a room where everything is handcrafted.
Wow.
Yeah. I wish I lived in a world where this was still the dominant aesthetic.
Mm.
And in London in the 1880s, this was what was popular.
So they had this like a natural immunity to the nonsense?
Well, I look at a picture like this, and I really wish the British Empire was still around.
Yeah.
Maybe this feels a little old-fashioned today, but it's much less offensive on the eyes.
Well, and like, if you can do some art, you're gonna not be impressed by some idiot who's using a paint roller.
Yep. Again, every art history professor out there is going to tell you why Piet Mondrian was profound for using the paint roller, but you know, you look at this and it speaks for itself.
Yeah.
You don't need a professor to tell you why this is aesthetically pleasing.
Yeah. And this is DIY.
If I have one, criticism, if I have one criticism about this, it's maybe a little too elaborate for my tastes, but that probably says more about me being propagandized into a world of late 20th century minimalism, where I decorate my apartment at IKEA. We mentioned both of these guys, William Morris and John Ruskin, when we talked about the Crystal Palace last time. They were both opposed to the soulless aesthetic of something that looked like it came out of a factory. So the key to the arts and crafts movement is that these two guys emphasized living in a room where everything keeps its humanity in a world where everything is rapidly industrializing and everything is manufactured in a factory.
Like Tolkien.
Yep. Oh, just wait.
Oh.
Morris spent his whole adult life running a company that made custom furniture and custom textiles and hand-painted wallpaper for clients. And, you know, this guy, he wasn't some soulless capitalist, quite the opposite. He was a communist.
Ooh.
Well, in the 1800s, in the middle of the Industrial Revolution, these words were still fluid enough that they didn't have the definitions that boomers use in their Facebook flame wars today.
Well, this is like before everybody starved.
Yeah. Well,
it's not like there were like, you know, tens of examples of states that have tried these ideas and like, what do you mean we have no food?
Well, Morris didn't even want to run one of those states. He was more like the hippie who moves out to California and lives in the woods with his guns and his marijuana.
Oh, okay. Timothy Treadwell style.
Yep. He explicitly wrote that he was not a utopian socialist, and utopian socialism is what you associate with the Soviet Union. Believe what you want to believe about the redwood hippie. I'm a lot less worried about him than I'm worried about the 36-year-old commie girl boss human rights lawyer. You know, the one who gives a pro bono defense to Rajiv, the rapist from Punjab.
Mm-hmm. One of them is going to cancel me, and the other one is not going to cancel me. So,
well, the funny thing is, after she gives a pro bono defense to Rajiv, the Punjabi rapist, she's going to cry me too.
Yeah.
Now,
enjoy it while it lasts, ladies.
I'm not a communist in the least, but I can at least support Morris's opposition to the world of concrete slabs.
Yeah. Which ironically makes me think of communism. So.
Well, on that note, last time we talked about two proto-science fiction novels which laid out two differing visions of communism. One was actually Morris's book, News from Nowhere, about a rustic society in the English countryside where everybody is content with what they have and in touch with nature. This book was in response to his Yankee contemporary Edward Bellamy, who wrote a book called Looking Backward, about a utopian industrial society that produces so much abundance that America becomes a gigantic corporation that takes care of everybody's needs, and you just need to show up and punch the clock for a few hours a week, and nobody knows what to do with all the leisure time they have.
Oh.
We tried that experiment in 2020 and 2021.
Yeah.
You send people home and give them a check, you don't get a bunch of leisure time.
Nope. You get an opioid crisis.
Mm-hmm. You get a worse opioid crisis.
You don't worry, yeah.
Now you can look at this room filled with handcrafted art, and you can understand what inspired Morris's vision of utopia.
Yeah.
You can also look at Bellamy's book, the one about the industrial utopia, and you can see what inspired the Rietveld House.
Mm-hmm.
Because the Rietveld House looks like an IKEA showroom.
Yep.
Looks like everything was mass-produced in there.
Right off of a freaking assembly line.
If I had to be forced to live under communism, I would much rather have Morris's version than Bellamy's version.
It would be easier to hide food with all this stuff around.
Not least because Bellamy's version was essentially the model for the Soviet Union. But the thing you have to understand is that people with a certain temperament, they really do look at the IKEA aesthetic and see artistic vision. I look at stuff that's clearly factory produced. I see no creativity at all.
Someone figured out a way to do it cheaper if you put it together yourself.
Well, in some sense, this is one of the fundamental existential divisions of the 20th century. You know, you have Morris and Bellamy in the 1890s having their two visions of communism, but last time we talked about how this repeats itself in the 1930s with Huxley and Tolkien. Again, two very different images of society and two very different opinions on industrialization. You even see it in the 1990s when you get movies like Fight Club, where the unnamed narrator talks about the soullessness of living in a high-rise apartment full of furniture taken from a catalog. You know, the plot is set in motion when he comes home to see that a mysterious gas explosion has destroyed his collection of IKEA shit.
Good opener.
Yeah. So the arts and crafts movement, it was the first. So the arts and crafts movement, this one, the good version of it, it was the first one to try to dissolve the boundary between artist and artisan. In general, it emphasized handicraft, it emphasized natural materials, and it had an ethos of anti-industrialism.
I can get behind this. This is better.
Yeah. Again, if I have to sympathize with a communist, I'm going to sympathize with the hippie who moves out to California and lives in the woods, if I have to.
And those handicrafts.
So Morris, he's going to look for well-to-do patrons, and he's going to have a niche audience. He's basically the anti-IKEA. Early on, he designs this house for himself in collaboration with architect Philip Webb. And this house is often called the first arts and crafts building. Now, this building at first glance, you might not see what's special about it. It has quite a simple exterior, even though the inside of it is a little more ornately decorated.
Looks like maybe elves or a hobbit live here.
Yep. Well, one of the things about this house is that it has custom windows for every room. That is definitely an anti-industrial decision for the era. In fact, windows were one of the first things to be standardized.
Yeah.
Another thing which is a little less obvious if you haven't studied any architecture is that the design, it seems to draw attention to the architectural features themselves, like the arches and stuff. They seem to be the creative decisions themselves as opposed to decorating around the arches.
Okay, yeah.
You know, the artistic decisions are what arches and windows to use as opposed to them just being features to decorate around. Yeah, that's a good way of putting it.
Yeah.
The idea of using the architectural features themselves, this is the idea that gets taken a little bit too far when the Bauhaus and De Stijl people run with it half a century later.
The Lebowski villains.
Yep. Well, they run with it and call it expressed structure. So let's compare and contrast these two buildings.
Okay, so the one on the right looks horrible, and the one on the left looks not horrible.
Again, people spend their whole lives becoming art history professors or architecture professors writing papers that don't say anything as profound as what you just said there.
Call them like I see them, folks.
As art and aesthetics should be.
Yeah.
If you need a lecture to explain why something isn't ugly,
Yeah, it's ugly.
it's ugly, yes. You know, you can listen to the lecture or you can just look at the fucking thing.
Amen.
These are two buildings that try to make the point that you can be creative and original by stripping things down to the basics. But one of them is clearly designed by a guy who wants to be a good citizen and a good neighbor.
And not crater the property value around his house.
Yep. The other one is clearly by a guy who wants to find out what he can get away with.
Yep. He needs to find out where the real line is.
The Red House, it has a large servant quarters, because again, the guy does have some communist sympathies. But of all the sins of communism, I am not going to include a trust fund kid who puts a large servant quarters on his private property.
Well, we learned from the last guy, you gotta be able to confine these people.
You have to have a wall between them.
Yeah, you have a locking door at least. You don't want any repeats of the frickin' incident.
The Red House, it's close to the city. It's in Kent, so that he can make his commute, but far enough away so that there's green space, which in theory he wants. But after a couple years, he says, fuck it, this is a pain in the ass. I'm just moving back to the city and living in a sardine can close to my studio. Kind of like me.
Yeah.
You know, I have to say, I do have some sympathy for the way this guy thinks. You know, in fact, if you believe in physiognomy, this guy even kind of looks like me.
Yeah, I can see it. You guys are distant cousins or something.
Yeah, I'm not doxing myself. You're going to have to take my word for it, but I do kind of look like this guy.
I can vouch.
Now, when I go to important events, I have a Canterbury Tales tie. And I guess it makes sense that this guy spent the last few years of his life making ornately printed books, and his magnum opus was this version of the Canterbury Tales.
Okay.
Just imagine how much labor is required to create the plates to print and bind this thing. But I mean, this guy spent his life making custom furniture, so I guess this book is in line with that level of Asperger's.
Yeah.
It was supposed to feel like you were reading something old and sacred, because clearly this guy respects the history of his culture, unlike creatives today.
Yeah.
You know, this is the kind of guy who would do an art history podcast, make it 30 hours long to make sure he gets everything right. So again, clearly I like this guy, even though he's a dirty communist. But
It's okay, he's like a hobbit communist.
yeah, by the 1880s, he founds the arts and crafts movement, which is concurrent with the Impressionists, and arguably much more significant, even though you don't hear about it as much.
Yeah, this fills a hole for me in terms of like some of my own culture and
Yep.
why my grandparents were so into crafts and stuff.
Yep. Well, to be clear, he is not some outsider in the hipster cafes, though. You know, this guy is an Oxford-educated intellectual. And as I also said before, in some sense, his utopian book, News from Nowhere, was a precursor to Tolkien.
Okay.
In fact, he spent the last few years of his life writing fantasy stories. He basically invented the fantasy story set in a medieval world that he built up himself. He essentially invented, you know, world building, at least as far as medieval stories go.
And then you got Edison.
Well, one of his more famous stories was called The Well at World's End, and it had a king named Gandalf in it. So take draw your own conclusions about who influenced whom.
There's also Wagnerian opera.
Now, some historians think that Morris might have had Tourette's syndrome. I think he was just a twitchy nerd.
You call them spastics for a reason.
He said that you should have nothing in your house that you do not know to be useful or believe to be beautiful.
Prevent hoarding.
Well, I really wish this was still the ethos behind creative activities.
Be a healthier group of people.
Yeah. Now, as I said, Morris, he founded the movement with John Ruskin. He was the most important critic in the Victorian age. We've talked about him in a couple of previous episodes as well. Ruskin was already writing essays and lectures on the importance of labor in art, and he hated the Crystal Palace just as much as William Morris did. So once again, we see just how arbitrary some things are and how few people can become the setters of taste. If Ruskin had actually liked the Crystal Palace, he probably would have thrown his status and his prestige behind somebody more revolutionary than William Morris. And as much as I try to keep these episodes self-contained, I do need to make some callbacks right back to the early episodes. Just look across the channel at France, where his contemporary, Charles Baudelaire, was championing Gustave Courbet and Edouard Manet. Our second and third episodes compared 19th century art in England to 19th century art in France, and we said that it was interesting that French revolutionary art was incredibly formal, you know, David was doing very academic paintings of the Roman Republic, and it ends with the Impressionists doing more abstract stuff. Whereas English art started with Turner doing his very stylized and abstract landscapes, and it ended with a much more formal aesthetic during the Edwardian age. One of the reasons is that right in the middle of the century, the main cultural critics in London and Paris decided to champion two very different styles of art. There's not that many people who make the important decisions when you look at history. It's just knowing who those people are. Yep. But I mean,
like all the tech billionaires that surreptitiously control our society.
Yep.
Oh, okay. I, for one, love our tech oligarch overlords. Thank you, mighty algorithm.
Yeah, David Starkey, I saw an interview with him. He said, just as the real 19th century doesn't start in 1800, it starts with the French Revolution and ends with World War I. The real 20th century starts with Duchamp putting a urinal in an art gallery and ends with Musk buying Twitter and carrying a sink in. Yeah. So they can say, let that sink in, because he's a fucking nerd.
The autistics are taking over, guys.
It's just weird to think that one of the wheels on which history turns is the fact that Elon bought Twitter 3 years ago.
Yep. Yeah, that's going to be super important.
So in the 1880s, you get a number of these arts and crafts guilds. They are shown off to America at the World's Fair in Chicago in 1893. Here are some of the other prints which clearly show off the autism of the creators.
Oh yeah, that's weeaboo.
Yeah. Well, the one on the left is Arthur McMurdo's Wren City Churches about London's architecture. And the one on the right is Aubrey Beardsley's illustration of Oscar Wilde's Salome.
Oh, okay.
So again, very ornate, certainly not made for mass production.
Oscar would be proud.
Yeah. Like the one on the left, these days you could do this in Photoshop, but just imagine you had to make metal plates to do this.
No 3D printer.
So that's the English contemporary of Impressionism, and because London is the cultural center of the world in 1880, these ideas are going to spread. 10 years later, the Art Nouveau movement is going to spread across Europe, building on this idea of combining art and handicraft into something whole. Like this is the Via Majorelle in France. It's definitely not a medieval Gothic cathedral, but it's also not the Rietveld House either.
Yeah, there's something going on here. Again, I'm going to say, like, if hobbits lived here, I wouldn't be shocked. I'd be like, oh, Bilbo.
Well, this would have been considered a completely modern aesthetic in its day.
Yeah, you can see that.
Lest anybody think I have an overly conservative attitude, I quite like this stuff.
I think so, too. I'd live here.
Yeah, like I said, it was modern in the year 1905, and it really doesn't feel all that dated now.
Oh, it's not, again, this probably wouldn't crater the freaking property value around it, so.
Well, I don't know how to describe it, but there is still almost a forward-looking quality about this, even in the year 2025.
Yeah.
Certainly looks better than all the Borg cubes everywhere.
Yeah.
The irony of everything is that in the obnoxious post-war aesthetic, the style, Bauhaus, all their glass boxes, that stuff was supposed to be revolutionary, but it feels dated. It feels stuck in Back to the Future.
Yep.
And yet this, you still feel like it's forward-looking in the way that an old cathedral is forward-looking.
Yeah, this would fit in anywhere. There's a timeless quality.
Yeah. Well, it's a timeless quality, and yet it's a very specific, early 20th century quality as well.
Yeah.
I mean, just like a lot of good Victorian architecture is architecture of its time, but it also is timeless.
Yeah.
Art Nouveau, it makes use of the fact that the world has industrialized. If you look at it, you see the metal siding on the windows. Like that couldn't have been done before. So this is certainly making use of the fact that technology has changed. Look at the stylized pillars on the window on the left, for example. Like look at the green columns that almost look like vines climbing the side of the house. That's certainly typical of Art Nouveau in the early 20th century. And remember what I said about the Red House, where it was simply designed, but the architectural features are what gave it its flair?
Yeah.
This is just pushing that idea farther. But it's essentially the same thing. It definitely has its ornamentation, but it's not ostentatious in the way that some buildings could be with, Greek columns or whatever else.
Yeah, it doesn't insist upon itself.
Yeah. So, arguably the first Art Nouveau building is this one.
Now I got one question.
Yep.
Was there a door to lock the manservant up at night? They locked them up if they did, though. They don't want any rehashing.
So, this was arguably the first Art Nouveau building. This is Hotel Tassel in Brussels, Belgium. This is where you really see the arts and crafts movement starting to transition into something else. It still has that industrial flair. It still uses steel with exposed rivets. But one thing that you'll notice is that it has these whiplash lines all over the place, inside and out, like from the grate and the doors on the exterior to the wallpaper and the carpets inside, and even the furniture. It all has these whiplash lines that are going back and forth. This is not a building that was built and then later on decorated with paintings and artwork. The whole building was clearly, meant to have a united aesthetic. Here's another example of Art Nouveau that always comes up when you look at the history of this stuff. This is the Paris Metro. The signs, the lettering, it's a very distinctive style because the Paris Metro was inaugurated for the Paris World Fair in 1900.
Okay.
Now, before continuing, we see something important. Now, I'm off on a tangent of a tangent, so we have to do the inception thing here, and I have to jump back up to the top level of this story. This stuff is always glossed over in the narrative. According to the narrative, going into World War I, there are all these weird avant-garde movements putting up odd paintings like the Cubists, the Futurists, the German Expressionists, whatever. Then coming out of World War I, we have Bauhaus, the visionary institution that combines art, design, handicraft, architecture to build the modern industrial world. Whether or not a professor says it explicitly, it's always framed as though Bauhaus was the first place where people started thinking holistically about aesthetics. And from that point onwards, the concept of art includes the hideous or at least uninspired concrete architecture that we see all over the place. Bullshit. That was going on well in advance. That was going on with the arts and crafts movement. That was going on with Art Nouveau, the idea of building a complete building where everything from the furniture to the exterior had, a holistic aesthetic. I don't know what the best word for that is.
And yet, unlike the ugly house, I don't want to take a freaking sledgehammer to it.
Well, that's just what I mean. This whole narrative thing, there's a bunch of airbrushing, there's a bunch of 1984 stuff going on if we're going to say that Bauhaus were the first people to start combining everything into the idea of a complete building. Bullshit. It was being done for decades. It was being done better for decades.
No memory hole in here, folks.
Yeah. Clearly, just from the name Art Nouveau, the concept of art as the whole building was there by the turn of the century because the word art is in it. And also, the arts and crafts movement was 20 years before that. That also contains the word art. So it was not some fringe movement just being shown off at the World's Fair. Just like American Gothic, there is some real 1984 shit going on with the timeline. It would be one thing if the narrative was art changed into this new Gestalt idea that focused on craftsmanship. And then in the 1920s, everything got industrialized, and the Stijl and Bauhaus people hijacked art. That would be more germane to the story of how art got ugly, but unfortunately that isn't completely true either, because you had Art Deco in the decades after that. So, again, the official narrative, the official story, it's complete bullshit. But the official story is that World War I and the Dadaists came along and wiped the slate clean, and then Bauhaus built a new concept of art for the New World. But there's just an elephant in the room when you're talking about Bauhaus this way. The narrative tries so hard to hammer on about how art was the purview of the academies, and then these independent thinkers broke free and started doing art on their own. If you want to talk about seizing the art from the academy, why do we focus on an academy?
Good question.
Such mysteries need to be solved before our story is done. But in the meantime, let's jump back to our tangent of a tangent and ask how we got from buildings with these weird but cool looking serpentine trims to the Rietveld house within 20 years. Because London was the center of the world in the 19th century, there were a lot of cities across Europe that had artists who wanted to take a crack at the arts and crafts movement, and then at Art Nouveau. And in Glasgow, you had buildings where the trim was a little less ornate, a little less flowing, and more rectilinear. But you still see the ideas of new architecture for a new century. This is the Glasgow School of Art. This aesthetic would have been considered completely modern in the year 1900, but this is Glasgow.
Yeah.
This is definitely Glasgow.
Yeah, this feels like Glasgow.
Here is the sign on the Glasgow School of Art. So you see, even the lettering on the sign is supposed to be made modern. And again, this would have been considered completely modern in the year 1900.
We're going to teach all of the arts. Head button, paint.
Yep, it's my people. Don't cultural appropriate. The one on the bottom left, that's called the Hill House. It's made out of concrete, but again, it doesn't look like a big concrete slab. It has curved walls and it has shapes. Yeah, exactly.
Like a castle or something.
Well, it's fortification, but it's clearly done with the aesthetics in mind.
Yeah. It's not ugly. Again, it looks like an old castle or something.
Yeah. The one on the top left, that's a chair done by a guy named Charles Rennie Mackintosh, who became a little bit of a Scottish national icon during Art Nouveau. Clearly, that chair is less about comfort or utility than it is about matching the decor of a room. But again, that was the 1900s and the 1910s.
Did it get thrown at anybody?
It's Scotland, so probably.
All right, that's good.
I just imagine the leverage you could get on that
I
thing.
was thinking, if that lady had hit that guy with that.
And the one in the bottom left, that's the library at the Glasgow School of Art. Again, it would have been considered completely new and modern in the year 1905. And I wish we lived in a world where that was still the dominant aesthetic.
Yeah, if the Harry Potter kids were in there, it wouldn't look out of place.
Yeah. Now, moving over to Germany, you have something called Jugendstil. This is the Baron's house in the bottom left. This is the Haus in Vienna in the top left. This is the wedding tower in Darmstadt on the right. In all of these cases, you see the design is minimal. At least there's no ornamentation on any of these buildings. Again, the architectural features are still used to make the design decisions as opposed to putting decorations on the building. And the lines are certainly less whiplashy than the French and Belgian buildings, but it still features clean facades with geometric shapes and custom windows. You see that in everything here. When we look at Bauhaus, everybody talks about how they designed these simple, modern, and functional factories, but that turbine factory in the bottom middle, it was built in 1909 and it beat Bauhaus by 10 years.
Wow.
So again, it's just bullshit that we're told that Bauhaus is this forward-looking revolutionary place. We talk about it because it pissed off Hitler.
Okay.
Which we'll be getting to.
Yay.
The name Jugendstil, it comes from Jugend magazine. So it was originally explicitly an arts and crafts magazine, but it very quickly developed its own aesthetic, and this is what became the aesthetic of German avant-garde art before World War I.
Okay.
If you read Mein Kampf, Hitler finds this stuff a little bit less offensive, but he's still not happy about it. The magazine was culturally important in urban settings, but it's not Rolling Stone, it's not MTV. It only ever had a circulation of about 30,000 subscribers at its peak. But it definitely shapes cultural tastes among certain quarters.
Okay, like HBO back in the day.
But the missing link between this stuff, the nice architecture we were looking at, the Art Nouveau stuff that was a little more minimalistic, but still didn't look like shit. The missing link between that and the Die Style Bauhaus graph paper shit comes in 1897 in Vienna. Usually, when you read about the Vienna Secession, you read about a group of artists resigning from the Austrian Academy, which they deemed to be too formal. Now, this is not like some group of crazy people in Paris who got invited to Gertrude Stein's apartment and then started doing these weird acid trip paintings.
Probably because of the pop brownies.
Yep. Yeah, you remember that.
No, I've learned a lot from this podcast.
If this is the first episode you're listening to, yes, we talk about the history of pot brownies in an earlier episode.
Older than you think.
From a lesbian.
Yep, Jewish lesbian.
Yeah, the Vienna Secession, they do stuff with money from Karl Wittgenstein, who is a steel magnate. He's a father of the philosopher. He's a father of Ludwig Wittgenstein. And they build their own building called the Secession Gebäude, which I don't speak German, and I didn't say that angrily enough to sound right. But they build their own building called the Secession Gebäude, which is supposed to be their shrine of Art Nouveau. Like a big fucking cabbage on top.
Yeah, this looks like somewhere like Skull and Bones might meet, like some creepy freaking fraternity and fucking...
Well, this is what I mean when I say that this story had to be as long as it is, because it's so fucking self-referential, because this calls right back to our first episode. When Vasari wrote The Lives, he basically defined the concept that we call art, even though that word didn't exist in his day. And in that book, he had a woodcut showing the goddess of fame blowing a trumpet and 3 goddesses of painting, sculpture, and architecture rising from the dead. If you look at that, there's 3 Gorgons, there's 3 Medusas near the main entrance, and those are supposed to represent painting, sculpture, and architecture. Now, I'm not sure I would want to use Medusa as my symbol, but, this is what you would see as you were walking in. You'd see that. It says it explicitly. Those are the German words for sculpture, painting, and architecture.
Okay.
I guess it means that they want to petrify the traditional arts in the past and do something new, so you're going to be staring at the Medusa if you want to be an old artist. I don't know what the fuck they're doing. It's not quite...
They're doing pop brownies.
Yeah, well, it's not quite the age of the manifesto yet, but this building itself is almost considered to be a manifesto, the incarnate manifesto.
A glove was thrown down here.
Yeah. It's not just a meeting place, it's basically the temple for a cult. So the most famous name to come out of the Vienna Secession is Gustav Klimt, who we spoke about in a previous episode. But more importantly, this is the height of Habsburg's Austria, right before the Americans decided to wipe the Habsburgs off the face of the earth a few years later.
Sorry, Habsburgs.
Now, by some miracle, these crazy Vienna secessionists, they were actually able to score architectural commissions. And this put a lot of very bad ideas in people's heads. Usually, if you want a building, you pay an architect to design it according to your specifications. But the secessionists were able to convince rich people, let us, being the insufferable creatives with opinions that we are, let us browbeat you about what you want your own building to look like.
Jesus Christ. Imagine you go get a haircut and you're like, I want it like this. And they're like, fuck you. You get a mohawk.
Well, they were able to get a few of these things built. This is the Majolika House by Otto Wagner, who is kind of the big cheese of the Vienna Secessionists. Mm-hmm. It's not as obnoxious as some buildings you see, but it could be worse. But I'm also going to say this is something that the neighbors might not be completely pleased about.
Something sits on the eye a little strange about this.
You know how in suburban cul-de-sacs, wasps love to be passive-aggressive about each other's Christmas decorations?
Oh,
I could imagine that happening here.
Yeah.
The next one is the Portois Fix building. Again, you're starting to see the Tetris aesthetic.
Yeah, getting a little silly.
Though to be fair, tiles were relatively new in this era, at least mass-produced tiles, so that ceramic tile facade was, it was trying to make a statement. It was an artiste saying, let's do something new. Then you had Stocklit Palace. This was, I think, some rich guy's private residence.
It looks like where an evil witch lives. Like if the Ringwraiths lived here, I'd be like, okay, that tracks.
Well, again, the Art Nouveau stuff, it was modern, but it didn't look out of place. This is starting to look out of place.
Starting to get a little strange.
This doesn't look timeless.
No.
This looks like it's stuck in the early 20th century.
Yep.
And this is the Loose House, the one on the right. You can see this side by side with the old Vienna architecture. Again, it's not the ugliest thing out there.
Looks like a Ramada.
Yeah, exactly. It's clearly more minimalistic. It clearly puts more focus on the geometric shapes. I'm not going to say it's the ugliest thing. I'm not going to say it stands out like an eyesore. But go with the old stuff, guys, if you have the chance. Again, these are not the obnoxious Rietveld house, but they require a little more chutzpah than I would appreciate if I was paying somebody to design my own building. The Secession's publication was something called Ver Sacrum, which is Latin for sacred spring. Now, the great thing about modern technology is that we can try to get a feel for how true the official story is, and I was able to scan a couple of issues of this old publication in, and then feed the scanned text into ChatGPT to get a translation. So it was still the 1890s. It was not as revolutionary as you would expect from something post-World War I, but it starts with the story of ancient Rome, where the plebs threatened to leave and create a new Rome, only to be talked back. But then when Rome was able to weather great trouble as a sacrifice to the gods, the next spring would be considered a sacred spring, where some people were sent out to start a new community, and that community was called a secession. So these people see themselves as the new Roman secession. At least according to their publications, they said that they didn't want to turn their backs on the ancients, they just wanted to forge new ground, and more importantly, they said Viennese artists love to bitch about how the public has no taste, so let's actually make something for the public. That's a fairly common delusion of grandeur. I'm going to make something that's so aesthetically pleasing that the plebs are all going to have a new appreciation for art.
Oh, right. Yeah.
I am under no such delusion of grandeur here. I know that about 1,000 people tops are ever going to view this and understand this, and good for you, my fellow Spurgs.
Yeah, way to go, guys. You found it.
Of course, this is a fairly common delusion of grandeur, but it's also not terribly out of place for the age of Nietzsche. Like, we're Zarathustra, we're coming down from the mountain with wisdom to share with the masses. In another essay, they talk about how to introduce modern art to Vienna, and this may be seen as a little bit of foreshadowing, in case there may be some young wannabe artists who happen to be in Vienna at the time.
I'm sure nothing will come of them.
Yeah, but there are 3 maxims that they come up with. First is to agitate, you can't fear being ridiculous. Second is you need to be hated. In Vienna, people only respect you if they hate you. And number 3 is never be appeased. If you keep saying no to the people of Vienna long enough, they eventually get uneasy and give you what they want.
This sounds very Semitic.
Now, I swear I'm not making this up. I scanned the first issue of their first publication. I scanned it, I fed it through ChatGPT and saw what they had to say. This essay said, Viennese painters have to show, if they can, how to be an agitator.
Yeah, there's some groups that just, there's the line that's posted and then there's the real line. And there's some groups, they need to know where the real line is.
Well, I'm just saying, there's going to be one Viennese painter who has to show, if he can, how to be an agitator. The first issue, it also ends with an essay titled Better Late Than Never about furniture, proving that the arts and crafts stuff is in the zeitgeist every bit as much as Nietzsche is in the late 19th century. He says that the Austrian Museum of Art shows developments in British and American furniture, so why the hell can't we get anything new in Austria? And I do have some sympathy for that point of view. But when people across Europe get word of the secessionists and how they can be obstinate and insist that they can be artistes about every last detail about their architecture, including the furniture, this idea is going to spread. And that's how you're going to start getting all of these weird creative movements that wanted to be like the Vienna Secession. Wait a second, we can browbeat our patrons? This is awesome. They all want to be like the Vienna Secession, where you had to get into the community by affirming their weird academic theories. And that's where these manifestos are all going to start.
Right, yeah, okay.
And these academic theories, they always have something to do with denouncing the bourgeoisie, even though nobody could define what the word bourgeois even meant. And most of them were bourgeois themselves.
Yep.
I'd say almost all of them were bourgeois.
They all would have been kulaks.
Well, bourgeois was usually just a stand-in for whatever you didn't like that day.
Yep.
In fact, most of these academic and aesthetics theories just came down to we are so much better than the bourgeois Philistines, and we are replacing them as the sacred guardians of art. And this kind of becomes the spirit of avant-gardism in the 1910s and the 1920s. It's also why so much of the shitty avant-garde art seems to be in code, looking at you cubists, because nothing says we have special knowledge like a code that only enlightened people understand.
You need to read an essay to like this.
Yeah. But this is why so much of the 20th century academic bullshit is just esoteric theories that come out of movements that are cargo culting the Vienna Secession.
Okay.
And that brings us back to the De Stijl movement in the 20s, when the Great War has come and gone. De Stijl and Bauhaus are two of these many movements that want to be the next Vienna Secession, and De Stijl just wants to do it with their weird graph paper shit. Now, this is not art history, this is history, and the United States has made Europe safe for democracy. The Netherlands, it was already a constitutional monarchy, and it was neutral during the war, but the Russian Revolution kind of spooked the Dutch into making some major democratic reforms, lest their king end up like the Tsar.
Yeah, Russians will scare you.
Now, the Vienna Secession was operating in Habsburg, Austria. That was the most unabashedly monarchist and Catholic nation in Europe, the one which Woodrow Wilson was determined to smash to pieces. That is an environment where a breakaway group of eccentric artists can be a little obnoxious, knowing that if they piss off too many people, the emperor is going to make sure they never eat again. Germany and the Netherlands, they're now brand new democracies run by socialist parties. This isn't 2025 where democracy means bribing minorities with welfare to get votes. This is the 1920s, when that fetish is directed at factory workers.
Well, those were the good old days.
We will be talking in our 30s episode about the popular literature of the era, which was a lot of oddly homoerotic fan fiction about people who worked with their hands.
Can you imagine having a job? It's like sci-fi to these people.
Yeah, well, if you're a well-connected avant-garde artist in 1920s Holland, you don't get the contract for some experimental building with a flowery facade the way you would in Habsburg, Austria. You get the contract to make worker housing.
Okay.
And worker housing means taking a fixed budget and making as many modular units as you can.
Yep. Some things never change.
Sure, it's less romantic, but remember one thing. The whole point of this artist community is that you're trying to spin up these weird academic theories and justify how non-bourgeois you are. And if you get the contract for worker housing, you can definitely run with the anti-bourgeois angle.
I'm slumming it, folks.
So here's yet another clue about how art got ugly, or at least how architecture got ugly. In the 1920s, you could keep up the pompous attitude by designing a community of 200 concrete cubes. So the idea of aesthetics started to become a second thought. One of the members of the Stijl movement was a man named J.J.P. Oud, who became the municipal housing architect of Rotterdam during the war, and one of his first projects was this one. This is the Spangen Housing Project. Now, it can be described with a number of adjectives like functional, efficient, adequate, affordable.
Yep. Economic.
Nothing is necessarily wrong with it, but it's certainly been stripped down to the bare necessities. A couple years later, in 1922, he does this one. This is the Oud Mathanes housing project.
Yeah, this is looking a little familiar for any Boys in the Hood fans.
This is even more stripped down, because if there's anything the proletariat wants, it's to come home after a 12-hour shift at the factory and feel like his housing is efficient.
Oh, I'm going to beat my wife in this hovel?
Well, yeah, any ornamentation whatsoever is now gone at this point. And you can't really tell from the black and white pictures, but this does follow the neoplastic color scheme. The houses are white concrete boxes with red roofs, blue doors, yellow frames, and window casings. So again, this is like the Piet Mondrian's painting, and everything here is white, yellow, red, and blue. Again, nothing quite completes the feel of modular housing like a tacky color scheme, right? But a few years later, he goes one step farther and does this, the Kiefhoek housing project.
It's like a strip mall.
For the authentic feel of being in jail.
Yeah, seriously.
When it's not enough that your apartment feels like a sardine can, you need the building to look like one too.
Yep.
Let's compare and contrast Art Nouveau with this thing. On the right, you have a building that is, again, maybe a little minimalistic, maybe a little bit plain, but still fits in with the streets of Vienna. On the left, I have adjectives.
Many adjectives.
For all this talk about bringing art to the masses, it seems like the masses are getting a very poor substitute. This kind of shit, it works in Florida, where it was built up in the 60s to be a cookie-cutter playground for the baby boomer generation.
There's nothing beautiful to make it look like shit, in contrast.
Yeah. I can see Bill the boomer uncle strutting into this place on the left, wearing a tacky polyester suit, flashing a wad of cash from his wholesaling business. I could see that guy living in the place on the left.
Oh, yeah.
I can't quite picture Linus the Dutchman getting any joy out of living here, though.
No.
Also note the flat roofs. We'll be talking about that shortly as well. But to be clear, this is just one guy. There are not all sorts of red, yellow, and blue boxes popping up all over Europe. And if there was any justice in the world, these people would have just been remembered as a footnote, a relic of the 20s when people were doing all sorts of weird and wacky things before Europe went back to finding the next style of art, which happened to be Art Deco. But like so many other things, I'm talking about it for a reason, and this de Stijl stuff lasted somehow. Here's a picture of the school that I need to drive past on the way to work.
Ugh.
This is another artsy-fartsy building showing off an idea that was already beaten to death by the 20s.
This is uninspiring.
It shows off its flat roof and its stained and streaked gray exterior because, again, the stains and the streaks are almost as characteristic of modern architecture as the primary colors.
Yep.
So what happened? First of all, it wouldn't be a pretentious art movement if there wasn't a modicum of backstabbing and arguing over trivial nonsense. So we bring back the two main figures of de Stijl, Theo van Doesburg and Piet Mondrian. The whole aesthetic of de Stijl is just a bunch of horizontal and vertical lines with spaces colored in with three colors. There's no way that's going to turn into a professional falling out, right?
Yeah, how could it? What's there disagreeable?
Remember, we're doing Rashomon here, so we're going to see appearances from characters in other storylines. In 1921, Van Doesburg, he meets with El Lissitzky, who we talked about in our Russian constructivist episode. As a reminder, he did the Red Wedge. He did this thing. And Lenin said, no, you're not going to be in charge of propaganda anymore. The peasants on the farm aren't going to get what you're trying to say here.
They will not starve for this.
To be fair, they'll starve for
They
anything.
will starve, but this will not inspire them to starve quietly.
Now, he is a total acolyte of Kazimir Malevich, the Black Square guy. And he wrote quite possibly the most dull children's book ever. And Van Doesburg thinks it's going to be the most brilliant thing ever. It's called About Two Squares, A Tale in Six Constructions. Van Doesburg is going to publish this book in Dutch because he thinks it goes along with Mondrian's neoplasticism. And this book is considered a seminal moment in graphic design. And just to prove that I'm not making anything up, here is an English translation. This is a children's book.
Yes, again, you could think it looks like game hair. Sometimes there are two cubes, children.
Yeah.
Sometimes there are two circles.
It's not exactly Dr. Seuss when it comes to children's books. I'm going to say that art has already lost something by the time we've reached this point. Hitler may have had a point when he said that there was something wrong with people's souls if they find any profundity in an argument between Piet Mondrian and the Black Square. But again, modern fine art school kids are having this discussion in the classroom, and we have to talk about it for that reason. But it was all played out by 1923. It's not original.
We've been having the same discussion for 100 years.
Yeah. I can't remember the full story here. I think the red square comes in from outer space and displaces the black square.
See, it's trying to explain gentrification to kids.
This is why Walt Disney hated these people. But notice one thing about this book. The squares in the typesetting, they're all at kind of funny angles. But it's going to inspire Van Doesburg to do something that truly offends Piet Mondrian to the point where the de Stijl movement is going to come apart over a feud. What do you think he does? Are you ready for this?
What did he do?
He put everything at a slight angle.
At least he didn't let the black guy out of the cage.
He calls this elementarism. It's basically the same thing as neoplasticism, but it's rotated a few degrees.
This is like something out of Jonathan Swift.
Apparently, Mondrian thought that putting things at an angle ruined the spiritual harmony, or whatever the fuck is that about?
You know how freaking the World of T-Shirts kid, if you tell him to put the fries in the bag, he wigs out. Maybe this was his like fries in the bag. Clearly, there's no adults in the room that can be like, okay, we're not going to let you two do art anymore.
Well, von Duisburg and Mondrian are literally never going to speak to each other again over this.
That's how seriously they took this. It's not like they were making, they're making fun of us. This was serious to them. This was their religion.
So, De Stijl, it does last a couple years after this falling out, but this is the last commission they get in 1926. This is the Café au Bet in Strasbourg, done in collaboration with Hans Arp, who, if you remember from a few episodes ago, was one of the original Dadaists. Because all these people can sit around a fucking table.
Yep.
Well, that's the De Stijl movement. I guess it looks somewhat modern. It looks like something you'd see on a university campus.
Yeah, this looks like a badly designed coffee house on a satellite campus.
Yeah. So ends the story of the De Stijl movement, and so ends this hour-long tangent. So now we have all the background in place to tell the story of Bauhaus. Bauhaus starts in 1919 with this manifesto. Like I was saying, this institution is where it all comes together and gives us the truly insufferable middle-class faux bohemian arts student who would draw something like this. I said before that the initial Bauhaus manifesto talked about how they were going to combine architecture, design, craftsmanship to create the complete building. Hopefully that makes a little more sense, because now we have 40 years worth of context leading up to it, as opposed to the usual story which just says, yeah, these Bauhaus fuckers came up with a brilliant idea to make the whole building. No, not original at all. The usual story is that they were starting from scratch in the rubble of World War I, and that they rethought everything about architecture, and that the manifesto made some revolutionary declaration that the complete building was the ultimate aim of visual arts. Now that we have our 30,000-foot view, it's bullshit. At the very least, it's not revolutionary, because the idea of producing the whole building is 4 decades old and completely mainstream at this point. But unlike the arts and crafts movement, Bauhaus is going to actually lean into industrialization instead of the way Morris wanted to avoid industrialization at all costs. And Bauhaus is going to design shit specifically to be mass-produced. So think about the autistic German engineer with no sense of humor designing a kitchen appliance with rounded edges. That's the kind of stuff that Bauhaus is going to be leaning into.
Okay.
Like this.
Yeah, it looks like a toilet.
Yeah, this is the kind of housing that somebody would call, I don't know, sleek.
Yeah.
Not beautiful, sleek.
Sleek.
The manifesto, it also talks about how the new design school is going to be completely modern and a cathedral for socialism. Because just like with JJP Oud in the Netherlands, Weimar Germany is a freshly minted democracy. And if you want government commissions, it's a lot easier to fish for a state commission to make social housing. And by talking about a building which was going to be the cathedral for their new and enlightened artistic theories, these guys were clearly following the model of the Vienna Secession and their secession building. What did they mean by completely modern, though? Like, if you wanted to design windows, there would be glass workshops. If you wanted to design metal, there were going to be metal workshops. And students were expected to participate in poetry and ballet and writing publications, costume parties. The introductory literature said that you were expected to contribute to a, quote, cheerful atmosphere.
Sounds like North Korea.
Well, does this not look like every theater kid you've ever met?
Yeah, this could be like my own theater camp experiences.
Yep. Well, just imagine every group of theater kids in the park singing "Always Look on the Bright Side of Life." That's Bauhaus.
Yep.
Again, we are completely stuck in the 20s. Everything I find out about in the 20s, like, oh, that's where that comes from. The archetype of the insufferable middle-class art school student, Bauhaus.
Wow.
It gave it to us. The place was known for its parties involving elaborate sets and costumes that the students would have to build and design. So if you've ever known a cohort of art school graduates who talk about being against middle class conformity. Meanwhile, they're all off the factory line.
Yep.
That's these guys.
Okay.
Right down to their weird sexual practices.
Is that an artist thing or is that a German thing at this point?
It's a Bauhaus thing. At least the specific brand of it.
All right.
Yeah, Bauhaus is also known for its weird spiritualism and esoteric Eastern religions. One of the main instructors was a guy named Johannes Itten.
Good Dr. Evil?
He pushed this weird neo-Zoroastrian cult called Mazdaznan,
Oh, of course.
which it was basically the same shit you'd hear if you go to a yoga studio.
Yeah.
You know, he insisted on shaving his head, he insisted on wearing robes, and he also insisted on irrigating his colon.
Oh, yeah. That's comes up surprisingly often with weird cult people.
At one point, Bauhaus started insisting on everybody having a vegetarian diet. So it's not just that art hasn't had any new ideas since the mid-20s, it's that art school has been stuck in the same cookie-cutter format since the 20s as well.
Jesus.
So who wrote the manifesto? It was written by a man named Walter Gropius. This guy here.
Yeah, he looks like a manifesto writing kind of guy.
Yep. Just as now, when an American looked at this guy, they thought he had the aura of European sophistication, as opposed to just being a quack with a funny accent.
Yep. They love a funny accent in the States.
Yep. He was a quack saying what he needed to say in order to get the next government handout. But Americans loved his sophistication. He was an architect who, before the war, had been part of another one of these wannabe Vienna Secessions, the Deutsche Werkbund, who believed in combining architecture with the applied arts. And had the war not happened, he would have just been another one of these insufferable architects. So I'm not sure how much he actually believed in socialism or communism. But after the World War I peace settlement and the abdication of Kaiser Wilhelm, he got involved in the November Group. Now, the November Group were not directly involved with the Bavarian Soviet Republic or any of the other attempted revolutions, but like all of these guys, the November Group were a bunch of creatives who were opportunistic enough to jump on the political turmoil and to use it to promote their artistic projects. They're also mentioned in Mein Kampf, so they would be on certain people's radar screens in the 30s. The November Group, they have a manifesto that talks about how painters, sculptors, and architects have been taking too much money from the bourgeoisie and it's blood money. Again, nothing new.
We must only get our money from the poor.
This is no different than the trust fund girl who says there's no ethical consumption under capitalism. No different. You know, we need to be true socialists looking to be part of the brotherhood of man, but like anything else, they're not really condemning the bourgeoisie so much as just looking for commissions from self-loathing bourgeois people. And Gropius, he was the chair of the November Group's Working Council for the Arts, talking about how all arts need to be united under architecture. Again, now that we have the proper context, this statement is more milquetoast than revolutionary. It's been going on for 40 years. But he also talked about how architecture had to be the business of the entire people. Translation, I want to be the guy with the commission for the workers' housing projects.
Yeah.
And I will totally denounce my own bourgeois background in order to get that contract. So again, just to put things in the proper context, because this always conveniently gets left out when an art history lecture talks about Bauhaus, there are all these weird art groups in the 20s competing with each other for workers' housing contracts. They're going to get in a bidding war by arguing that they can build the most bare-bones design because efficiency and the almighty dollar are the real goal at the end of the day. And because all of these groups are led by these intellectuals who love to huff their own farts, they're just going to get into this retarded competition to make their design even more soulless and concrete box-like than the last guy.
Race to the bottom.
Well, beauty is bourgeois. Apparently the bourgeoisie are the only people who don't want to live in the cell block. That's what the proletarian want.
Yep, they love bosses.
Nowadays, the equivalent would be the grad student who insists that the poor black guy in the ghetto doesn't want more police, he wants social workers.
Yep, because he's never met a black guy. He doesn't realize that they hate social workers even more than they hate police. Social workers steal your children. That's what they do in the ghetto. So.
Also, any functional black guy wants police in his neighborhood.
Yep.
But yeah, that's the backdrop of everything we're about to see. And once again, Hitler's not necessarily wrong when he says that these concrete blocks are the only form of art that touches the soul of a Bolshevik. I am not saying Hitler is right about everything.
No, just
that. So what exactly happened at Bauhaus? This is the famous circular curriculum design diagrams. And it was filled with a bunch of these workshops where an artist and a craftsman would teach the class together. If you look at the circle on the outside, that's the preliminary course, or the Vorher, or the Vorkurs, the preliminary course which everybody had to take for the first year, or for the first semester. Initially, it was taught by Johannes Itten. That was the colonic irrigation guy.
Oh, yeah. Gandhi.
Yeah, he would teach about his theories of color, his theories of forms, his exercises in drawings, his studies of material, etc., etc. Joseph Albers, who we will see later on because he definitely plays a role in art getting ugly, he taught the Vorkurs at one point, and he would do shit like giving students newspapers and telling them to turn the newspapers into art. The talented kids would like fold the newspapers into castles, boats, sculptures, whatever. But some of the students, especially the ones who were there to be graphic artists, they didn't know anything about building sculptures, so they would just fold the paper in half and make a tent. And when Albers would come back in, he would say, well, castles are meant to be made out of stonemasonry, but a tent is meant to be made out of paper, so you are doing art properly.
Homie had never seen a tent that would melt in the rain.
Well, I mean, he's talking about the materials, about how paper has tensile strength or whatever shit he was talking about. And if you watched our last episode, you know that this is pretentious bullshit taken straight from the Russian constructivists, namely Rodchenko's concept of factura, which was also cribbed by our good friend Lotus Kang. To jump forward a bit to when we look at abstract expressionism, Albers is a guy who spent his life making a series of thousands of paintings called the Homage to the Square.
Oh,
he makes thousands of these.
Jesus Christ.
I think no further comment is necessary.
No, well, this is terrible.
But many art schools these days have an introductory course, and it's usually modeled after the Bauhaus introductory course. Early on, Bauhaus was in line with the German Expressionists, with their geometric forms and hard edges that were maybe not always the most realistic. We looked at people like Ernst Kirchner a little while ago. Here are a couple more of his paintings. You know, not the most realistic. This is what you call German Expressionism.
Okay.
This is a distinctive style that comes about in the avant-garde era in the first quarter of the 20th century, and this was indicative of the branch of Expressionism that came from Dresden, the Bridge. The other one, the Blue Riders, the one that comes from Munich with people like Kandinsky and Paul Klee, both of whom end up teaching classes at Bauhaus. Those guys were more like stoners with weird ideas about spirituality and abstraction, and in the last episode we talked about how Kandinsky originally moved back to post-revolutionary Russia, got an early Soviet posting, which was then promptly usurped by Osip Brick when Brick said that Kandinsky's weird theories were too bourgeois. But this is, at the end of the day, the age where every intellectual gasbag is trying to fillet Sigmund Freud. And Kandinsky ends up at Bauhaus teaching painting classes where he taught about the latest psychological theories as they apply to abstract painting. And I wish I was making this up, but this is when Gestalt research is going on, and Kandinsky tries to incorporate Gestalt research into his paintings. Here's something that he produces at the time. This is called Yellow, Red, Blue in 1925. Now, I'm not going to say that this is hideous, but I expect better from anything that I'm putting on my wall.
Yep.
There was also a German expressionist style of architecture, which is a little more minimalistic than Jugendstil. It's, for example, this building. This is the Einstein Tower in Potsdam, designed by Erich Mendelssohn in 1921. It's an observatory, so it's obviously functional. It's just not graph paper functional. Also, there's no paint on it.
Yeah.
Even though this building is not associated with Bauhaus, it's very indicative of the style that early Bauhaus was going for. Like, note that there's really no sharp edges because the message is supposed to be that we know that the poor peasants can't afford or appreciate brick masonry.
They can't afford edges.
That's bourgeois. Edges are bourgeois. So that's all fine and good, but in 1921, our friend from the De Stijl movement, Theo van Doesburg, moves to Germany. This is probably when he meets with El Lissitzky and thinks that it's the most profound thing to publish a children's book about two squares. But van Doesburg, he wants to teach at Bauhaus, and Gropius says, no, you're too fanatical. So that's the kind of guy we're dealing with.
Wow.
This is the guy who got in an argument over whether or not it's a big deal to rotate a three-color painting a few degrees. So...
pretentious of their own butts.
Yeah. But this is the guy who was too pretentious to teach at Bauhaus.
Wow.
Actually, what do you think Van Doesburg looks like?
Steve Jobs, kind of?
Look at that.
Oh, God.
He's wearing a monocle.
That's upsetting.
Is this not the face of a chill, easygoing Dutch Protestant?
Yeah.
Especially the one with the monocle.
Yep. No problem here.
He's trying to be a man of the people. Nowadays, we associate the monocle with the Monopoly guy.
Yep.
So I guess he never ended up teaching at Bauhaus, but he did end up moving to Weimar between 1921 and 1923. And his house, it becomes the site of many a spirited debate between Bauhaus faculty. In 1922, the first International Congress of Progressive Art is held in Dusseldorf. And what happens? Well, Van Doesburg looks at a bunch of Bauhaus designs that were in the same vein as the Einstein Observatory. He said the curves were all too bourgeois, and that to be non-bourgeois, everything has to be mass-producible by a machine so that as many peasants as possible could live in it.
Jesus Christ.
And that was the genesis of the graph paper idea.
Oh, okay.
And it was going to take off like wildfire in this newly democratic Weimar Germany, because if you're trying to house as many workers as you can on the taxpayer's dime, politicians love hearing that they're actually enlightened by shoving poor people into cubes.
Yep. Yeah, I called it what Hitchens might say, hyper-irrigation.
So overnight, the philosophy went from being about uniting the artist and the artisan to the motto, art and technology, a new unity. And once
Dianetics by L. Ron Hubbard.
So once again, you see that the idea of utopia doesn't exactly look like Bilbo Baggins in the Shire.
No.
That is a very, very particularly British idea. Not a universal idea at all. Most places, New Jerusalem is basically a big concrete factory where everybody watches TV and pushes buttons to get what they want. And in 1923, you see the logo of the Bauhaus change representing this new idea. You see the one on the left, it's hand-drawn. It evokes the idea of the human holding up the building. It's got a symbol on the right that Hitler's going to appropriate.
Yeah. We'll call it, for the algorithm, a swastical.
We'll call it like a Buddhist good luck symbol.
There you go.
Post-1923, you have the logo on the right, which is supposed to send the message that we create things that come off the factory line, which means right angles and perpendicular lines. Even the lettering changes, which is quite important, because modern typesetting revolves around making posters that are simple and have block letters that can be easily read and mass-produced.
Like printed t-shirts.
Well, this is about as different as you can get from Morris's ornate edition of the Canterbury Tales. In fact, that ornate printing style is going to get largely shit on from here on out, including to this day for being stuffy and bourgeois. Now, let's not forget that this is Weimar Germany, where the school is supported by tax dollars. And the government is going to ask them to have an exhibition to prove that what they're doing is worthwhile. And I really wish we still lived in a world where publicly funded artists had to prove that they weren't wasting taxpayer money.
But I speak French.
That joke works in France and Quebec.
Yeah.
In 1923, they have their Bauhaus work show, and the centerpiece of it is the Haus am Horn. This is a single-family bungalow that is supposed to combine all of the Bauhaus principles to create the non-bourgeois dwelling of the future. Forget the Jetsons, forget Star Trek, I give you the Haus am Horn.
And the boys in the hood are always hard. Come talking that trash and we'll pull your card.
What the fuck is this?
It's a good prefab trailer thing.
This is supposed to be the culmination of avant-garde art. This is about a year before the beer hall putsch, and I'm just imagining Hitler saying, I'm going to throw you fuckers all into a concentration camp.
Yep.
And that concentration camp is going to be more creatively inspired than this fucking shoebox.
Yep. It's going to have a pool.
And showers.
Yeah.
When I say our culture is stuck in about 1923, just realize one thing. If you put a black woman named Shaniqua into this thing, you've got the DMV.
Mm-hmm.
And this thing is a UNESCO heritage site.
Oh, God.
So every institution insists that you're just missing something ingenious by looking at this thing and thinking it's a fucking box.
And whatever Big Brother said had to be true.
Let's look at a few rooms of this thing. This is
Twilight Zone shit.
Yeah, this is the kitchen, this is the children's room, this is the living room and the dining room.
Tron?
Well, Gropius got pissed off because the only thing people liked was the toys in the toy cabinet in the children's room.
Yeah, I can see that pissing him off.
It definitely has right angles. It definitely could come off of a factory line.
If you need to calculate the area of something, this is great. This is very convenient.
It's showing off modern life because your ancestors are definitely jealous that your house looks like the inside of a fucking refrigerator, right?
You're a Jack in the Box or some god.
I never thought that the revolution would be so boring.
Nope.
You know how every shitty band calls itself experimental?
Oh, yeah.
That's this house. It's experimental. Also, for some reason, the Wikipedia page finds it necessary to mention that this house was financed with an interest-free loan from a local Jewish banker.
Oh, you don't want to print the receipts on this.
That's what Wikipedia says.
Yeah.
Wikipedia has been thoroughly propagandized. I didn't make that up. I didn't even find that in the book I was reading. That's what I saw off of Wikipedia.
Sorry, tried.
And like everything else from the 10s and 20s, people hated it for the exact same reason they hate it now, saying that it looked like a coffee grinder.
Yeah.
Professors will say this building was ahead of its time, not appreciated in its day.
No, this is just an ugly little house.
I mean, I'll agree that it wasn't appreciated. And of course, the gray color, it was a symbol of efficiency and progress because colored paint was a sign of luxury and far too bourgeois.
The Puritans loved gray too. Jeez.
Now, with the shift from houses to like processed cheese from the factory, there was one major faculty change at Bauhaus. Itten, Mr. Red Robes and Colonic Enemas, he decided that he didn't want to be part of the factory aesthetic. So he resigned, and the Vorkurs, it was taken over by someone who agreed much more with the technological philosophy. He was actually a member of the November group, Laszlo Moholy-Nagy, who at this point was a constructivist.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, that name is Hungarian.
Oh man, I figured he was from the subcontinent.
Huns, gypsies,
Yep.
there's some crossover there.
God bless the Silk Road.
Moholy Nagy, at this point, he was a constructivist, and he was going to train the incoming students to design things for mass production. He took over the metal workshop, and he shifted the focus from craftsmanship to designing prototypes for the factory. Now, just a word about the world of 2025. Since the modern arts program at most universities is based on Bauhaus, I truly do believe that the university system is starting to collapse in large part because the university system of 1920 was meant to be integrated into this network of factories and manufacturers. And now that all of the manufacturing is done in Shenzhen, what's the fucking point of going to school anymore? Especially art school if you're going to be trained to make something for mass production.
Yeah.
I've met plenty of people who went to OCAD and then became tattoo artists, but I guarantee you that if they had the talent to become a tattoo artist, they would have been able to develop that skill without going to art school.
Most of them still have to be waitresses. So cut out the middleman, skip the loans.
So Christmas 1924. Gropius and the rest of the faculty decided that they had had enough of the local government in Weimar asking them to prove that they're not wasting taxpayer money. And they all resigned, moving the school to Dessau, which is today the place that most people associate with Bauhaus. Dessau was an industrial city, so there was a lot more money available for industrial prototypes, and Bauhaus was almost run like a business. It's amazing how communists and socialists in the 20s seemed to have no problem at all with industry when it meant scratching their egos and calling them creative geniuses. I wonder if that has any parallel with today.
Yeah, good point.
So once again, the idea that commies hate industry is just false. They're not Luddites because Luddites are working class.
Yeah.
These are not people who want a simple life in the countryside because that's Britain and that's bourgeois. They just think somebody else should do the work in the factories so that they can use the excess production for themselves.
Oh, of course.
Now, if you look at pictures from the Dessau era, the instructors at Bauhaus, they almost look like scientists wandering around a lab, which is, I guess, where you got the Bill Nye archetype.
Yeah.
You know, somebody looking more trustworthy because he's wearing a lab coat. Gropius, he designed the compound for the school, which is still kind of famous today. And at this point, he really gets the graph paper aesthetic down to a T, right down to the lettering on the building. Now, doesn't this glorified prison just inspire you to go out and change the world?
Yep. Yeah, it looks like every liberal arts campus.
Oh, wait, it looks like my high school,
Yep.
where every teacher was hooked up to a steady flow of either Prozac or weed.
Yep.
In fact, by this point, all of these weird avant-garde movements, they're starting to get involved in that race to the bottom on purity and functionalism. So for all the talk about how artists now had absolute freedom in the new democratic world after World War I, it took less than a decade for that freedom to turn into a competition to see who could make his buildings the most black and white and the most box-like and more obnoxious with their flat roofs and sheer facades. Our next episode is going to be about Paris. That's when we'll be talking about Le Corbusier, the ultimate cult member when it came to expressed structure, which means that if your building was made out of concrete, you wanted to show that it was made out of concrete with no ornamentation.
Oh, God.
Gropius, he used the factory aesthetic for the Bauhaus Dessau building with glass walls supported by a concrete skeleton and a lot of those perpendicular lines. Here's the rest of the compound where the faculty lived.
Oh, God.
Just imagine a bunch of pretentious people convincing themselves that they live in beautiful housing.
Yeah. Yeah.
For all the stuff that government money goes into maintaining as a heritage site, this seems considerably less inspired.
Yeah. We don't want to preserve this.
In 1928, Gropius resigns for reasons that are still not completely known. Most likely the Golem got out of hand because a bunch of the students were communists. And this was the golden age of fighting in the streets.
Okay.
And just to be very clear, Gropius was not a member of the tribe. He was a Gentile.
Oh.
And I said at the start of this episode that Hitler was going to save a lot of his ire for Gentiles. Gropius was one of them. Another one of them was a man named Ludwig Mies van der Rohe. If that name sounds familiar to you, we've already seen his work in this episode. He was the guy who designed the Seagram building. This ugly thing.
Yeah.
The completely uninspired building with the restaurant known for mediocre food, decorated by Mark Rothko. We mentioned that the avant-garde between 1885 and 1914 was a group of a few dozen people across Europe, all of whom could fit into a room, and that's certainly still true. These same names keep coming up over and over and over again, but something is going to happen in the next couple of decades. Matisse and Picasso, they're hustlers, trying to find eccentric art collectors looking to buy their weird stuff. But they basically think that they're going to die in obscurity, even though they both end up finding fame. Within 40 years, these weirdos are getting the contract to design major buildings in New York City. Something weird happened in the interim.
Yep.
The art and architecture of the American century is going to be all of this garbage that stems from Bauhaus, which is a rat's nest of communism. And we will see in the 1930s episode how this shit, which nobody even liked in the day, managed to take over the architecture world, especially post-World War II. But Mies van der Rohe, who is he? He's known for the motto, less is more. He didn't make up that motto, but it's certainly associated with him. And this building here, it's definitely less, but I'm not sure if it's more. In 1929, the World's Fair was held in Barcelona, and Mies designed the German pavilion. And it's not ugly by any means, it just looks like a Florida retirement community built in the 60s. Here's a reconstruction of it.
One of those old school McDonald's.
Yep. Yeah, it even looks like a drive-through there. Again, you can see the graph paper here. It's not as obnoxious as the Rietveld House, but if you built this in an old neighborhood, it would definitely stand out, and not in a good way.
Oh, yeah.
Instead of the walls of like yellow, red, and blue, he swaps it out with plaster, marble, and onyx. But again, it's still a piece of graph paper at the end of the day. And that rock pool, it's something that clearly inspired many a jacuzzi in a boomer's house. But one thing came out of this pavilion, known to every architecture student. Going right back to the arts and crafts movement, you needed to design furniture to match the decor, and every pretentious mid-century architect had this bloody thing in his office or apartment. The Barcelona chair.
Oh, yeah, I've seen these.
This thing was supposed to be the exception to the idea of designing things for the factory mold. This is actually supposed to be a luxury item for Spanish royalty, based on the cerule chair, which came from ancient Rome. Now, the Barcelona chair actually does require a lot of handcrafting, probably because of the leather upholstery, which is why, to this day, the official Barcelona chair carries a ridiculous price tag. That's like $5,000 almost.
Come on. Get that on the market for $200.
Yeah, sorry, $4,196.
That is a healthy margin, I'm going to say.
So the Bauhaus came to an end in 1932 when the local Nazi party drove them out of Dessau. Mies tried to open Bauhaus in an old factory in Berlin, in an old telephone factory. But the next year, the man with the mustache came to power, and Mies decided to just close up shop on Bauhaus when he showed up one day and the Gestapo had literally padlocked the doors of the building shut. So it goes. Unfortunately for the rest of us, we will see when we get to our 30s episode that the ultimate unfortunate Deus Ex Machina happens when all of these fuckers get jobs at American universities.
Oh, okay.
So ends the story of Bauhaus. Hitler, he definitely considered them to be cultural Bolsheviks, and he wanted rid of them. But we have to finish the story of Weimar Germany. And to finish that story, we need to look at what art was going on outside this weird government institution that completely destroyed architecture with its weird blockhouses. So after 1923, you probably had the last two true avant-garde art movements. In Paris, you had Surrealism, and in Germany, you had Die Neue Sachlichkeit, or the New Objectivity. New Objectivity, it attracted radicals from both the red team and the brown team, as well as artists from the Dadaists and the Expressionists. George Gross, he was a communist, and Emil Nold, he was one of the first members of the NSDAP. In fact, when the Nazis came to power, they told him he was allowed to remain a Nazi, but he was banned from making any more art for the rest of his life. And a lot of New Objectivity was just ripping on the war, on the Weimar Republic, on the new capitalist and democratic system that had been forced on them. Here's some examples of it. This is George Gross's Pillars of Society, about the ruling class of Weimar.
Yeah, this looks eerily familiar.
Yeah, the aristocrat is now a National Socialist who still dreams of leading troops on horseback. You have a journalist wearing a chamber pot on his head, a politician literally with the poo emoji on his head, soldiers covered in blood, and a minister preaching out the window to a burning city.
Yeah.
That's why they called it the New Objectivity. It was a grotesque caricature, but it kind of summed up the situation in Weimar Germany pretty well.
Yeah.
Next we have Christian Schad's Count Saint-Genois d'Adencourt. My French is terrible. It shows an aristocrat partaking in the bohemian decadence of Weimar Republic with two women who have rather masculine physiognomies.
Yeah. That would be fair to say.
This guy, Christian Schad, he also did a famous picture of two twinks making out. This is Dr. Meyer Hermann by Otto Dix. Unlike some Renaissance portrait of a merchant or physician, this shows what it's like to get a checkup from a doctor in a sterile modern clinic with bad lighting. Again, doesn't look realistic, but still gets the point across. This is also done by Otto Dix. Now that Weimar has supposedly, quote-unquote, liberated women by giving them the right to vote, and now that Sigmund Freud has given women the taste of sexual liberation, there came a new archetype, which in the day was called the New Woman. Opinionated and androgynous. I'm so glad we don't have that today.
Yeah, that would be really strange.
It's basically Joan from Clone High.
Yeah.
The only pleasant curves in this picture are on the table. Also sound familiar?
Yeah.
Now, I can actually somewhat forgive the ugliness in the New Objectivity, because it was intentionally trying to flip a middle finger to the Weimar Republic and this idea of capitalism and democracy instead of the military society which the Germans just craved to live under.
Yeah.
You know, they said we are not happy with the state of affairs, so they're going to portray the ruling class in an ugly and grotesque manner. So this is more of a political cartoon or a caricature than ugly art.
This is the Big Red.
Yes, yes it
okay.
is.
Oh.
Yes it is, or the Anita Sarkeesian.
Yeah.
In fact, Anita Sarkeesian even wore plaid, didn't she?
Yes, she did in those videos. All she needs is like Hoochie Mama earrings and like dumb opinions of video games.
Now, to be fair, you look at these people's work before the war, and I'm not sure all of them had the most talent in the first place, but I am willing to give them a pass just this once, and I'm willing to say it's acceptable, but it's still ugly. Like Dada, it's a reaction to the war, it's a reaction to the industrialized society, and it's a very 20th century idea that left-wing is anti-capitalism, because the right-wing extremists blamed the capitalists just as much as the commies did. However you define left-wing and right-wing, the left was opposed to royalty and aristocracy, and in the 1880s and 1890s, one of the ways to reduce the power of the nobility was to support laissez-faire capitalism at all costs, because stronger business interests and stronger merchants would take power away from the king and the nobility.
Makes sense.
Yeah, it was called the Manchester School of Liberalism, and after World War I basically eliminated it. And after World War I basically eliminated all of the hereditary rulers, there was just no reason for the left to be capitalist, or at least laissez-faire capitalist anymore, because they basically accomplished that goal. So when you hear your white bread uncle say, I'm right-wing, but I'm libertarian, it's such a fucking LARP, because that was just Manchester liberalism in the 1880s.
Okay.
And it was a great tool for the left. You know, I don't know what right-wing goals are ever going to be accomplished by giving more power to a corporation. So, buddy, just say you want low taxes and a life of hedonism. I won't judge you.
Yeah.
For both the left radicals and the right radicals, both the red team and the brown team, everybody blamed capitalism for the war. But I want you to notice one thing. The right-wing radicals might have used capitalism as a stand-in for industrialization, and the commies, they wanted it. The commies certainly wanted industrialization. They just thought that industrialization should be in the service of giving the excess to these shit-stain artists so that they could make their art, which was going to build the perfect society. It's just a little weird to think about that. You had some right-wingers who were completely opposed to industrialization, but all the commies wanted it.
Yep. They needed that excess to fund their art lifestyle.
Yep. You know, it's not just the Bolsheviks who thought this way, though. The American progressives, I'm going to punt on whether I should refer to them as communist or not, but as their informal manifesto, they had Crowley's The Promise of American Life, where Crowley talked about how if the United States organized their industry properly so that everyone got enough to subsist on, everybody would get educated, everybody would have enough leisure time to devote to creative pursuits, and every city in America is going to have as much cultural output as Athens, Florence, or Paris. Yeah, it didn't work out that way.
Nope.
And the American elites, they largely followed this model to plan their society for the first half of the 20th century. So I'm sure that once they put their welfare state in place in the 60s, every American inner city just became a cultural center that rivaled Florence during the Renaissance, right?
It must have blossomed.
Now, one thing that the new objectivists of both the red stripe and the brown stripe agreed upon is that the new democratic system was breeding complacency, because whenever there was a problem, people were encouraged to just wait for the next election cycle instead of actually fucking solving it.
Sure.
The message was that this democracy shit made society decadent and complacent, and it got rid of the will to resist. And this painting basically sums it up. This is George Gross's Eclipse of the Sun. To absolutely hit you over the head, the bureaucrat has no head and doesn't know what he's doing. Meanwhile, the head of the military and the head of industry are just playing him like a fiddle. Again, such a weird time that would have nothing to do with today, right? This is concurrent with the Surrealists in Paris, but this is the last of the avant-garde movements, and you can see why. The term avant-garde, it usually refers to the 1910s and the 1920s, even though these movements do go back to the Vienna Secession in 1897. But starting in 1910, you had the Futurist Manifesto talking about making art that worships machines and turning its back on the past. You had Metzinger's Cubist treatise, Du Cubisme, talking about transcending traditional art and multiple perspectives, changing the way that humanity perceives the world, because that's not pretentious.
Nope.
You had De Bruyck talking about the Nietzschean Superman, the Übermensch. You had the Blue Rider talking about spirituality. You had Mondrian talking about how De Stijl was going to create balance and harmony in the world by making everything a fucking crossword puzzle with 3 colors. You had the Russian constructivists talking about how art is finished because their new constructions are going to be something even better than art and the next step in human progress. Even the data manifestos talked about wiping everything clean, but they still kind of had an implication that something better was going to be built on top of it. So for 15 years, everything we've been looking at for the last 4 episodes or so, all of these avant-garde movements are optimistic and utopian. New Objectivity is not, it's dystopian. This is a completely different mood. This is not even neutral on the idea of progress. This is like, oh fuck, this is leading us to a bad place.
Yep.
And that shift from utopia to dystopia is another clue of how art got ugly. Because a lot of art history narratives talk about how the avant-garde ended in the early 30s when Stalin and Hitler put a hard stop to it. There is some truth to that, but Paris doesn't have a dictator. London doesn't have a dictator. Rome does have a dictator, but we've already talked about him, and he has no problem with futurists doing their weird paintings of the view from the cockpit. Those are actually pretty cool. Go back a couple episodes if you want to see that called Aero Painting. So as important as Hitler and Stalin were with their policy of you try avant-garde stuff, you're going to a labor camp, I think avant-gardism just ran out of energy. And you can see that from looking at this painting. No artist is going to spend a career complaining about society unless that artist is a feminist or visible minority getting grant money.
Or like a late night host.
Well, yeah, begging for money from the system that they pretend to hate.
Yep.
No actually talented artist driven by creativity is going to spend his entire career just complaining.
Yep.
Sure, it was great that Woodrow Wilson got rid of their aristocrats and gave them democracy, but that means being revolutionary means you need to pay attention to politics 24/7, and that just sucked all of the creative oxygen out of the room. Art didn't immediately become bananas duct taped to walls, but this was the beginning of the end for art. Because all that creative energy, it's now going to go into politics instead of painting. So just to finish this episode off, since this is Rashomon, we're telling the same story from multiple points of view, and we just need to tie together the Moscow story and the Berlin story. I mentioned that the Soviets decided that they didn't want any more avant-garde stuff because traditional methods of painting just made for better propaganda as far as the Gopniks were concerned. And from 1923 onwards, they were just going to go with socialist realism. And then in 1931, Stalin brought the hammer down and said, every artiste who has a creative vision is going to the Gulag. But in that interim between 1923 and 1931, there absolutely was a Soviet avant-garde. It was just in Berlin. Oh. Stalin figured that he was fine with degenerate art that destroys the soul as long as it was happening in somebody else's country. The Bolsheviks in Russia, they thought that they were setting off a chain reaction that was going to lead to other Marxist revolutions, and within a couple of years, the whole world was going to be communist because Marx said this was just science, and as Anthony Fauci said, you should trust the science. Yeah. The most modern equivalent to this is probably how in 2015 every millennial feminist sincerely believed that if she just denied sex to any guy who wasn't a soy jack, the world would become feminist in a couple of years.
How'd that work out?
Then within a year, Trump was elected.
Yep. Yeah, that was an interesting time.
And then within a couple of years after that, millennial feminists turned 37 and trying the same sexual blackmail, and now it's just a combination of sad, disgusting, and terrifying.
They're all ethically non-monogamous.
Ethically and ethnically non-monogamous.
Yeah, there we go.
But as soon as the Tsar abdicated, the Bolsheviks thought that global communism was just a year or two off, so they just needed to give a shove here or a light spark there.
Like the Millerites.
Well, we talked about the Munich Soviet Republic, last century's answer to Chaz. But there were also attempted revolutions in Hungary, in Berlin, and Bremen, and they were all the same. Idealism runs into reality within a few weeks. At the 1919 meeting of the Comintern, Trotsky said, okay, comrades, we used to think that the revolution was a few months away, and now it's probably a few years away. But the Comintern honestly believed that Germany was such a tinderbox, like a chicken without a head now that the Kaiser was gone, that they actually penciled in a date for the German Revolution.
Like the Millerites.
November 7th, 1923.
It's not far off, actually.
Now, there's one thing we do autistically here at Radio Free History. That's that we're very finicky about dates, because communists often break down when you realize that the dates are out of order, or conversely, things make a lot more sense when you realize two things are going on at the same time. The scheduled German Communist Revolution was November 7th, 1923. The beer hall putsch in the real world happened on November 8th, 1923.
Wow. Jesus.
Communists, you haven't gotten anything right ever.
Nope. Communists can't do anything.
So like so many other things in the history of communism, you have a few years of idealism followed by many more years of saying, fuck it, let's just give ourselves make-work jobs, undermining things in the name of the revolution. And they figured the best strategy was to start planting subversive operatives in Germany to start undermining the local culture. And the Comintern's main man in Berlin was a man named Willy Münzenberg. Münzenberg, he was chosen in 1921 to set up the MPR, which is something in German that roughly translates to International Aid for Workers, because the Reds were still fighting the Whites in Russia when a famine had hit. And in true communist fashion, they needed an intellectual with his hand out, laying a guilt trip on other Western intellectuals. The NPR got a few high-profile names to be their Bono or their Live Aid. Most famously, they got Albert Einstein and George Bernard Shaw to say, yeah, the Russian experiment has hit a snag, but it's so important that we help it out to prove that it works.
Oh, Jesus.
More importantly, though, a bunch of these German avant-garde artists are going to be their We Are the World. So by about 1925, the NPR is basically the Berlin Arts Council churning out publications and theater productions. Now, the NPR, they claim to be liberal and humanist against imperialism and against fascism. In reality, Münzenberg is just getting orders straight from Russia to do things that were convenient for the Russian cause.
Yep.
How do we know this? 3 ways. Firstly, we have access to the documents in the archives. Secondly, if you read a book like The Red Decade, which was written at the time by an independent journalist who was not enamored at all with the Soviet project, but was stationed in Moscow, he'll give you a much more unbiased account of what was going on. Thirdly, and most importantly, if you read Mein Kampf, Hitler's greatest ire was reserved for the art scene in Berlin, saying that when some new communist idea came into vogue, every newspaper, every theater, every artist was just magically on the same page.
What would that be? Good thing we have no idea what that would be like now.
And just to be clear, just like Walter Gropius, Willy Münzenberg was high on Hitler's shit list, but he wasn't a Jew either. Hitler's moving passion was fixing the art scene in Berlin. In reality, the NPR had open financial links with all sorts of international communist organizations. It worked with publishing houses in Berlin that were progressives. And in America, progressivism was still somewhat ideological. But in Berlin, the word progressive just meant that they were getting orders directly from the Politburo.
There we go.
From 1923 onwards in Russia, the state didn't want anything to do with avant-garde art anymore, and you could only buy art supplies through a state-owned store, so they could choke off the whole endeavor. But they were perfectly happy to tell their avant-garde artists, if you want to go make hideous art, go to Berlin. The main constructivist journal, it was called Vesh, or The Object, which was worked on by L. Lizitsky and Mayakovsky, who we spoke about in the last episode. By all means, it was a Soviet journal, if not an explicitly Trotskyite journal, but it was published in Berlin, And while constructivism was already being decried as bourgeois back in Mother Russia, nobody really cared in Germany. And Berlin was going to be the site of the first Russian exhibition in 1922, which showed off the constructivists and was supposed to portray Russia as an open place for international intellectuals. Malevich, the black square guy,
Oh, yeah.
he was never allowed to publish his theories in Russia, but the Soviet government sent him to Berlin in 1927 to have an exhibition. And he made sure to get all his crazy papers published when he had the one chance to do it. So the story of Berlin art in the second half of the 20s is a lot less interesting. It's really just two groups of propagandists fighting with each other, sometimes violently, and has been well documented. It was not unusual for extremists to switch from one side to the other in either direction, since Marxism is about bringing about the revolution to create communism at some point in the future. The communists didn't exactly see the rise of the Nazis as a bad thing, specifically because they wanted to destabilize the country into further fighting. One of the big reasons why Hitler won the election in 1932 was because Stalin personally ordered German communists not to support any moderates. The Comintern published a statement in April 1933 saying Hitler's rise to power was actually a good thing because it would destroy the old system and bring about the proletarian revolution.
Yeah, they were convinced that this was a step towards communism.
People always cite Hitler as an example of democracy going wrong, as if the Germans got caught up in a wave of mass hysteria. Let's just review the timeline. In 1918, the Americans don't allow the European countries to settle for peace unless the Habsburgs and Hohenzollerns give up their centuries-old dynasties. And at the end of 1918, the Kaiser and a bunch of constituent kings of Germany abdicate, leaving Germans with the message, "You've been given the gift of self-governance, figure it out yourselves." This leads to a power vacuum where a few small Soviet communities of rich kids try to establish themselves, going just about as well as you'd expect. Also, since Austria was completely destroyed, Germany is going to shoulder all the blame for the war and have a gigantic war debt. Also, you guys just went off the gold standard, so paying off the debt should be easy. You just need to print money.
What's the worst that could happen if they print a bunch of money?
So throughout the 1920s, the Germans get their first true taste of democracy, and it doesn't exactly look like a council of enlightened men calmly and soberly debating issues. It looks like two groups of crazy radicals, many of whom are failed artists fighting in the streets, each claiming that they have a better way than the other of overthrowing the system. Meanwhile, in the background, there's a senile old man who is technically speaking the head of the republic. Also, the Soviets are dumping all sorts of money in to subvert the country and to cause a revolution. By the end of the 20s, the Soviets say, fuck it, let's just accelerate the collapse and help Hitler get elected. Does this sound like a calm, rational, democratically minded people deciding one day to vote the wrong way?
Nope.
No, it doesn't. But you got to remember one thing. Nazi art, as much as we talk about the communist stuff, Nazi art was just as revolutionary, just as pro-progress, just as anti-democracy, anti-capitalism, anti-bourgeois as communist art was. If anything, Nazi propaganda called the bourgeois people a bunch of pussies who didn't have the spine to stand up to the communists, while the Nazis understood that the commies needed to be met with the same level of violence. In a democracy, you need to make the best argument. In my government, you just need to beat the shit out of the other guys. Yep. I'm also not going to pretend he was wrong. This is where the Nazis had a distinct advantage with their messaging. First of all, communists don't exactly tend to be physically intimidating.
No.
They just bank on the fact that you don't want to fight them because you have a day job. The Nazis are like, you think we're afraid of that? We're a bunch of unemployed failed artists as well. We'll kick your ass.
Yep.
But second of all, remember our friend Willy Munzenberg, Stalin's man in Berlin. At the end of the day, he's just a dipshit intellectual, and dipshit intellectuals have a pathological need to explain how they're using better ideas and not just using force. Think about the BLM protests in 2020. Thugs were burning down the cities for 5 months, and not a single person had the honesty to say, yeah, we're doing this as a power play. Yeah, every diversity hire is a white guy out of a job. Yes, every dollar that goes to our charities is a dollar that doesn't go to a hollowed out Rust Belt town. We win.
Yeah.
Nobody had the balls to say that, even though that's what was going on.
Let's buy some mansions.
Munzenberg, he's going to have the exact same handicap, especially when the order comes down from Moscow that Comrade Lenin ordered that all art has to be in the service of a coherent narrative of socialist realism. They talked about how the most important goal is that schools need to be like factories, churning out members of the intelligentsia that are all parroting our bullshit. Gee, how could that be relevant? By the end of the 20s, Munzenberg's job is to set up a bunch of organizations, one of which is the International Union of Revolutionary Artists. But somewhat ominously, that organization was transferred from Berlin to Moscow in 1930, which was right before Stalin brought down the hammer and said, fuck it, we're dropping the intellectualism, going straight up authoritarian.
Yeah.
But that story can wait till the 30s episode. In 1929, the Nazis start the Kampfbund für Deutsche Kultur, loosely translated as the Fighting League for German Culture, as the counter to Munzenberg. It also claimed to be an independent organization above politics, but it was very clearly a Nazi organization looking to get in wherever they could, just as the communists did. And in 1930, Nazi architect Paul Schulz-Nomberg, he was appointed head of the Weimar School of Applied Arts and told the museum to start removing anything by Bauhaus artists. And as we will see in the 30s episodes, say what you will about the Third Reich, they had much better architecture than the Bauhaus style graph paper stuff. And as you might expect, radicals and fanatics, they just want to be radicals and fanatics. So yes, you would regularly get communist artists switching sides to the Nazis and vice versa. One example was Joseph Thorak. He did this statue at the 1937 World's Fair. This guy was one of Hitler's great propagandists. He was an artist communist right up until the day that Hitler was elected, but, you know, radical's gonna radical and artists gonna beg for government commissions. When the communists started to get some pushback, they did what they always do. They pretended, we weren't all that radical, you guys are the radicals. Communist newspapers, they actually started denouncing Dadaism. Poet Johannes Becher, who was literally a Communist Party functionary, started saying that new objectivity was reactionary. And if there was ever one moment that marked the end of avant-gardism, that was it. When the communists are formally taking orders from Moscow to say that the avant-garde is bourgeois and capitalist, it's over.
Yep.
So this is the milieu into which Hitler is elected in 1932, largely with the support of Stalin. Stalin tells the communists in Berlin not to support the Social Democrats, ostensibly because a fascist government was more likely to destabilize Germany and bring about the revolution. And of course, this raises one last question that I'm going to end the episode on. It's the question of whether New Objectivity and German Expressionism actually were embraced by the Nazis. And the answer is not even close. Gottfried Benn, a poet who hated Weimar, he was broadly supportive of Hitler. He said that Expressionism could maybe be a useful tool to advance the German interest and the Nazi interest. When it came time to remove degenerate art in 1937, his work was denounced as degenerate, he was denounced as a pederast, and he was called a Jewish homosexual, even though I don't think he was actually Jewish. Himmler had to step in and defend this guy, but the next year he was told, all right, we saved your ass, no more poetry. Goebbels, he had some expressionist ambitions as well, but when the Nazis came to power, Hitler made it very clear there is not going to be any first few years of the Soviet Union where there's weird, cerebral, artistic propaganda. He was going to go straight to work on praising Hitler and the German people. And so the Rashomon storylines are 3 for 3. You had a weird avant-garde artist support the new regime coming to power, and that weird avant-garde artist was immediately told to shelve it. Mussolini, he had Marinetti, who was told that futurism had a place, but that his weird aero painting was always going to play second fiddle to the Renaissance revival paintings. Lenin had Mayakovsky, the alcoholic Gopnik poet in the yellow scarf, who ended up killing himself when the Soviet government wouldn't produce his weird experimental plays. And Hitler had Goebbels, who had his weird allegorical plays full of archetypes and was promptly told that he was going to get serious if he didn't want to be branded a degenerate. And you do not want to be branded a degenerate by Hitler.
No, not in this period.
The more interesting epilogue to close out the story of 1920s German art is to tell the story of what happened to Münzenberg. Hitler was elected in 1932, and Münzenberg said, you know what? I'm moving to Paris. He continued churning out pro-Soviet and anti-Nazi propaganda from Paris, but by the mid-1930s, he started to become disillusioned by Stalin's policy of murdering all the intellectuals. Then in 1936, which was right in the middle of the Great Purge, he got a letter from Russia summoning him to Moscow because Stalin wanted to talk to him.
Hey, Galileo, come see me in Rome.
And he decided it was not in his professional interest to go, so he refused and was formally condemned by the Comintern. And this is not like getting banned from some Facebook group of Marxists for transgender people for using the wrong pronoun. This got you blacklisted from every communist organization in the world.
Wow.
Then a year after that, Stalin showed the world that he really never gave a shit what these people thought when he entered into a pact with Hitler.
Yep.
Western academics have never forgiven Stalin for that one, because he committed the grave sin of not taking academics seriously.
You gotta trust the experts, man.
Why I care about your academic theory? I make alliance with Hitler. I get half of Poland. Then Hitler invaded Belgium, and the French government tossed all the German nationals into a concentration camp until they could figure out who was and wasn't a spy. And Münzenberg was tossed into one of these camps. Münzenberg was released shortly thereafter with two of his German communist friends and was found murdered the next morning.
Yep. Was it an ice pick this time?
Well, conspiracy theories abound about this guy's death, but one of the reasons we still don't know the full extent of Soviet infiltration of the arts in Weimar Germany is that this guy took a trove of secrets to the grave with him. And so ends the story of Weimar Germany.
Oh, it really was the communists screwing up the art.
Yes, it was. Anyways, that went on.
How would that be apropos of now?
Anyways, that episode went on long enough. We have one more Rashomon episode to do, and that's Paris. See you guys next time.
All right, you know the drill. Like and subscribe on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts. Support us at ko-fi.com/Radio Free History or at subscribestar.com/radio-free-history.